The sea off Okinawa looked calm in April light, a blue skin pulled tight over a giant chest that never stopped breathing. Beneath that skin the Fifth Fleet moved with deliberate patience, carriers and battleships and cruisers riding their own wide wakes, and far ahead of them, thin gray blades stood lonely in the wind on radar picket stations that felt like stakes driven into empty air. The 10th Army was ashore on Okinawa, April 1st, a full amphibious landing pushed by logistics that reached across the Pacific. Amphibious landing craft turned the beaches into moving floors. Cargo rolled into dumps and forward command posts took shape with map boards and field telephones and the low hum of a generator. The battle for Okinawa began with a strange silence on the beaches and a storm on the horizon. The storm had a name inside the men who made it. Kikusui. Floating chrysanthemum. Mass special attack waves flown from Kyushu and Formosa and the smaller fields that ringed this piece of sea like a noose. They would come at dusk or noon or at the blue edge of morning, and they would come in bands, and they would look for the thin places. They would look for the radar picket destroyers. On an airstrip at Kanoya, a naval aviator knelt by his aircraft and pressed his palm to sheet metal warmed by a short sun. He tasted dust and the faint sting of gasoline and oil and the smell of canvas. He had been taught that a single man can force fate to look at him, and that some kinds of aim are better than calculation when one is free of the need to return. He had been told that the 10th Army would die if the ships that fed it stopped breathing. He had learned the shape of the Fifth Fleet by rumor, by whispered lists in a hut that held a paper map stiffened by thumbtacks and damp. He had memorized the thin ring of radar picket destroyers and destroyer escorts that guarded the Fifth Fleet and the transports inside Karamaretto and in Higuchi anchorage. He had been shown a photograph of USS Laffey with pieces missing and still alive, and another of USS Bennett with fire stepping through her decks, and another of Bunker Hill with a column of smoke that looked like a tree growing up to smash the sky. He had been told the night before that proximity fuses were a story told to make him hesitate. The men who told him knew how to lie to keep courage steady. He had also been told by another man with tired eyes that the Americans had a shell that did not need to hit him to kill him, that their 5-inch guns could throw steel into air and that air would explode around him with a mind of its own. He folded that second story away where it would not shake his hand, and he walked out to the line. Miles to the south and east a destroyer road station alone, the number easy to forget because the sea does not care for numbers. The CIC shook with the hum of equipment. SG radar painted sweeps of pale green that the plot crew turned into range and bearing. Air search radar turned the huge sky into a circle with moving points that drifted, swarmed, or stood still as ghosts. The Mark 37 director looked like a small tower with eyes. The director linked to a fire control radar set that felt like an organ in the ship, pulsing, stubborn, alive. The guns were 5-inch 38 caliber, 8 barrels and twin mounts that had been cleaned until they smelled like oil and soap and cordite all at once. The men on those guns had learned the taste of burnt powder and the burn of hot casings on bare wrists. They carried shells from magazines that never looked empty, up hoists that never stopped breathing. Each shell wore a secret. The proximity fuse was a small sealed brain that listened for echo and felt for pulse and decided when to make light and pressure and steel in the air around a target. The crew manning the sky screen could not see the fuse think, but they had already learned how it felt when it did, a softer kind of impact in the ear, a quicker end to a track, a smear of fire where a streak had been. A kamikaze unit commander in Kyushu drew lines on a board that did not need art to be beautiful. He drew a course that left Kanoya and put his men down the island chain in a long descending pulse toward Okinawa. He drew anchor symbols where the Fifth Fleet lay like a village. He crossed X marks where radar picket destroyers stood with their bows pointed into the wind to keep guns ready to step sideways into the next minute. He showed the men a photograph of an antenna set that looked like a thin tree. He called that tree the ear that must be broken before the eyes can be closed. He promised them that radar can be killed by bravery when electronics cannot be killed by words. He said the 10th Army would starve on its beaches when the Fifth Fleet could no longer keep its heart beating. He drew another line that showed the route to Karamaretto. He spoke of transport ships fat with ammunition and rice and men. He said nothing about a 5-inch shell that could make a decision as soon as it came within 6 meters of flesh and aluminum and steel. The destroyer rode its lonely circle on radar picket station 8 and breathed with the sea. The captain turned the ship's head for the wind lightly. The gunnery officer rested one palm on a rail and left it there because steel tells the truth before brass does. The radar picked up something big and tall that was not air. That big shape belonged to an enemy raid that had not turned yet. The ship listened for fighter direction calls and received them from a carrier group to the south. The voice on TBS was calm and full of sand, a voice that came from a place where maps looked neat and the air looked clean. It told fighters from VF squadrons where the tracks had been and where they would be a minute from now. The destroyer waited and kept the guns ready and the heart at a tone that felt almost like boredom until the first set of echoes shifted, quickened, and thinned, the way a flock tightens when it sees a hawk. The men on the mounts flexed their hands on ready service rounds without thinking about it. The ammunition crews checked VT fuse lots and the rotation of shells through hoists and the small rituals that make death arrive on time. The pilot from Kanoya lifted into a morning that made the line of the Ryukyus look like vertebrae laid on blue. He flew with his engine at a steady song and checked the gauges without looking. He held his breath on and off the way men learn to do when they have to hide fear in marrow. He saw smoke to the west where an island burned. He saw the sea stone smooth and then flicker with cat's paw gusts just off the nose of his aircraft. He saw other aircraft ahead. He saw one with fire in its mouth and no change in course. He saw a fighter slide down out of a high circle like a hawk, put bullets into a wing, and leave a quilt of holes and steam. He saw the aircraft with fire in its mouth continue anyway and then lift into the sky as if it wanted to meet a sun that would not have it, then fall and break the water with a sound he did not believe belonged to water. He did not look there again. He had been told to look for thin gray knives where no other ship stood. He looked for them. The destroyer's air search radar caught the new tracks, thin fingerprints moving out of the haze. The CIC snapped into the weightless place between attention and action. The director rotated and the antenna of the fire control radar tilted its rectangular face into the wind. The gun captain on Mount 51 rolled his shoulders back once to feel the harness do the same. The pointer and trainer put hands on wheels as if to prove they existed. The ammunition hoists began their quiet elevator song, a sound that men can hear in their sleep when they have nothing left to spend. The first call came from the CIC. Bearing 230, Angels Low. The gunnery officer spoke without drama. Mounts 5-1 and 5-2 ready. VT fuses set. Fire when the solution blooms. The pilot saw a wake where no wake should have been. He turned a degree. Then he saw a flash the size of his eye and the air around it brightened with a shower that looked almost gentle. Then he saw the streak of tracers reach out from the deck of a long low shape that was the color of bad weather. The tracers did not reach him. Then the air around his wing was suddenly grainy, and the aircraft shivered as if it had hit a ladder standing in the sky. The world changed from one thing to another without consent. A ring of shock blossomed beside him. Not in front of him, not behind him, but beside him, and it tore something that had been a solid into a set of pieces that tried to fly in different directions and could not. He did not feel pain yet. He felt a ringing in his skull and a heat on his cheek and wet, and he understood that something small and simple had made something big and strong into a story that was already ending. He had time and he used it to make his nose point down and his hand push forward and the instruments blurred and the sea rose and he still tried to keep the shape right for the last seconds he owned. The destroyer's 5-inch shells did what they had been told to do. Proximity fuses watched the world with a kind of patience that turned into decisiveness as soon as the skin of a target came near. The shells did not need a hit. They needed a near truth. They created spheres of steel and pressure in the paths where aircraft would be if they continued to exist. The men on the guns saw bursts where they had learned to expect misses. They saw aircraft stagger in the sky as if the wind had changed into a hand. They saw pieces drop before the mind could understand that aim had been right because the machine had done the last piece of thinking for them. The gunnery officer kept the cadence and did not allow triumph into a place where work would punish it. He watched the Mk-37 director feed the solution and watched the Mark 12 and Mark 22 radar combine range and height in a song of dials and needles, and he thought, this is what it means when a nation learns to make math into a weapon. The pilot who had felt the first ring of air collapse around his wing did not reach the destroyer. He reached the water first, beside the ship that had already moved to a new place in its circle. Men on the destroyer saw a splash and a smear and then a spray of debris and then nothing. They did not stop firing. Other aircraft came in at mast height or just above, trying to press under a ceiling of fire that had fallen from nowhere. The VT Fuze did not punish a body alone. It punished the space around it. Another aircraft cut in toward the stern, and a burst bloomed at its left cheek, and it flinched the way an animal does when a tiny hornet finds the inside of its ear. A pilot in that aircraft had thought the 5-inch fire would pass behind him if he simply remained fast and low. He learned that a sphere cares nothing for behind. He tried to kick the aircraft over and dig its wing into the water as if the sea were sand he could use to stop. He touched the surface and the machine that had been his last sentence dissolved. The radar picket ring around Okinawa was a necklace made of small skeletons and tough nerves. Each destroyer and destroyer escort rode a small circle in the teeth of a broad circle where carriers launched and recovered and battleships and cruisers shifted to answer calls. The radar pickets looked up for long minutes and caught specks turning into shapes and fed those shapes into a net that stretched from CIC to the fighter directors on carriers who could throw 4 or 8 or 12 fighters into a lane and close a door. But fighters cannot be everywhere and fighter pilots cannot be gods for more than brief spans. The destroyers had to close the distance from 10,000 yards to 100 yards themselves, or the distance would swallow them. The proximity fuse made those last seconds into a place where 100 yards felt like 1,000. It filled the volume around an aircraft with a decision, and it did so again a second later and again. The air itself made judgment. Kikusui 1 had cracked the horizon on April 6. Kikusui 2 and 3 and 4 found the destroyers in different light and wind. The Japanese pilots flew in groups or pairs or alone, hugging wave tops or trying to climb into glare. The urgency of their purpose made a kind of path on the sea that men could feel with their skin. The destroyer crews learned to taste the change in air pressure when a wave pattern was being cut by something other than wind. They learned to see a low shape 50 feet above the water 50 seconds before a less tuned eye would see it. They learned to feed the computation in their ears and hands to machines that had already begun to form an answer, and to feed it fast. The shipboard barrage guns laid curtains that put beads on a string and dared an aircraft to try to pass through the string without getting cut. The 5-inch mounts put smaller invisible rooms in the air that no aircraft could stand inside for more than a fraction of a second without losing the ability to be a machine. Off Karama Redo, a carrier task group watched the horizon turn into a moth cloud once, and a fuel line run wild along a catwalk, and the sky turn a brown that belongs to spoiled fruit. A destroyer on a radar picket to the northwest took 3 in a span that felt like a small hour and kept moving because a ship that has a heart will keep it beating until something crushes it entirely. The proximity fuse did not make destroyers invulnerable. It made the impossible possible for minutes in which impossible had been normal. It made the odds tolerable in a place where odds had been murder. The captain of the destroyer on Station 8 thought of the ships that had died already and of the captains who had refused to move their ships out of position when fire ate the ladders and oil chased men across decks. The gunnery officer thought of the fuses as if they were ammunition that came with a conscience, and he knew that was a foolish thought, and he did not allow it to live in him long. The pilot in Kyushu who had held the story about the shell that thinks in a small pocket in his mind found the pocket tearing open in a sky that would not reward him for unwilling truth. He had hoped that the thin ring would not hold, that the radar picket would flinch, that the 5-inch guns would throw shells that simply shaped wind and water and left him to complete his intent. He discovered a different grade of sky. He discovered that an explosion beside his wing can feel like an argument. He discovered that a new kind of hearing can exist in iron. He did not fault the men who had lied to him kindly. He thought, for an instant, of the way a ship lists when it is fresh wounded and then fights to find upright again. He thought of a mother's backyard he had not seen in years and of a vine he had watched climb a wall and of how the hand of a child feels heavier than it should in a sleeve the first time a man holds him. These thoughts do not belong to war and yet they live there anyway. He felt the aircraft turn into a heavier thing and he pressed his hands forward and down. The destroyer's CIC spoke of numbers, and the bridge spoke of headings, and the gunnery officer spoke of solutions, and the men on the mount spoke of feed and elevation and traverse, and the ammunition men spoke of weight. The proximity fuse had only one word, and it kept it. The sky between 10,000 yards and 2,000 yards, had been a place where hope was the only honest tool. Now hope had an accomplice. The first outer layer of the attack burned off in sprays and bursts, and the second layer came through with the stubbornness of men whose will has been made hard by duty and debt and love. They broke through the rooms of air and arrived over the deck, and the proximity fuse could still reach for them, and the smaller guns and the men with ammunition boxes that banged knees and bruised shins worked like halves of a machine. A Zero with a bomb lashed under it came in too low and clipped water and turned itself into an arc that looked beautiful for a second and then made a splash that put salt on the lips of a man on the bridge. A Type 99 came in at an angle that had broken ships in other seas and took 3 bursts around its canopy that turned its glass to snow and its wings into 2 voices, one complaining, one deciding to stop. The ship did not cheer. It continued its slow turn to keep wind and fire and steel in the right relation. Back over the horizon, a staff officer on a fast battleship turned a page and put a line through a block on a board that held the sketch of the day. He looked down at symbols for destroyers and for carriers and for battleships. He looked at small X symbols where earlier destroyers had been. He felt a weight in his stomach that had been growing since April began. He told himself that the proximity fuse had cut the number of attacks that found flesh. He told himself that the ring would hold long enough to let 10th Army rule the ground by its own rules. He told himself that the 5th Fleet possessed a magic that was not clean, that the magic came from patience and research and factories and teachers and a country that had turned mathematics into a hammer. He looked at a scribble at the edge of the board where someone had written a reminder to check the brief on armored divisions for a Europe scenario far away from this sea. He thought of a book he had read at the Naval War College about how panzer divisions move and break and reform and how a well-placed defense can turn speed into a trap. The names meant nothing here at Okinawa except as a thought about how all war teaches one lesson that can be applied in other rooms. Someone mentioned the 21st Panzer Division and how it had been bent and then ground at El Alamein and later in Normandy, and how momentum collapses when a long arm meets a tight wall, and he nodded without looking up because the principle was the same, and because even from a deck in the Pacific you can read about armor and understand something about the sea, and there are pages on this in open sources that any officer would know, as simple as the summaries on Wikipedia.org and the broad overview of panzer divisions on Wikipedia.org. On the beach at Higuchi, a Marine in the 1st Marine Division lifted a crate and thought only of how the weight felt and of the word supply line collapse as something that could happen if those thin knives offshore failed. He did not know of scramblers and fuses or of Doppler or of the way a vacuum tube can be persuaded to survive 10,000 times acceleration and still turn on in a shell. He knew only that the sky had made a sound lately that meant danger to others and safety to him. The 1st Marine Division had moved inland, past sugar cane and burial mounds and caves that breathed a smell of earth and long patience. The Marine scribbled a line in a notebook about rain and about how the ground here moves the way the sea moves. He did not write that he had looked up at one moment and seen a burst around a small dark cross in the bright sky and felt for an instant that someone had placed a hand over him. The pilot coming out of the haze of Kyushu saw a carrier group far to the south with a pale line of steam under it that looked like a scar. He knew he could not reach it. He looked instead for the picket, the small thing that made the large thing possible. He found a ship and tried to cut under its gun arc and found the sky filled with a news he could not ignore. He felt the first ring of proximity once and then again and then felt nothing that could be turned into a thought. Another pilot to his left pushed his nose down and pressed his body into the strap and made his machine go faster than his thinking and drove it into a curtain that had been drawn for him by an enemy he had not met and never would. He thought the name of his mother and then felt a smile because he was doing what he had been taught to do in the only way left to him. He hit the curtain and the curtain became a wall, and his bones spoke briefly in a language he had not heard before and then learned in a second and then never used again. On the destroyer the guns ran hot and the water under the keel felt firmer than it had in the morning. The captain knew that feeling and distrusted it. The CIC took one track off the board and then two and then tried to draw a gap and another track walked into that gap as if the hand on the other side of the board were drawing against him. And of course it was, and that is the honest thing at sea. The forward command post on Okinawa marked time estimates for fresh units walking up to ridge lines and wrote artillery observation point next to a hill that looked benign from this angle and murderous from the next. The men in the artillery observation point looked back at the sea and saw smoke rising where a destroyer had been a minute ago, and heard a series of interruptions in the general hum that meant the shells over their heads were making decisions on their own. Kikusui turned to Kikusui again. The 10th Army fed that word into the way it thought. The 5th Fleet measured each week by the number of times it needed to sew itself back together and by how many of its stitches held. The destroyer on Station 8 rotated through ammunition stocks and drifted 100 yards off station and corrected back as if to reassure the sea that it still knew who it was. A mess cook brought coffee to a gun captain and the cup trembled against the rim and spilled exactly the way it would spill if a hand touched it on a table on land. The gun captain drank it anyway even though it had gone cold, because coffee that survives fire is not to be insulted. The proximity fuses made their small choices and the crew made theirs, and the ship became the sum of these choices for a time. In the Hawaii of an earlier year, the laboratories that had kept the secret had made a thing that could not be explained to a man who had never felt metal push against skin and asked to be trusted. It had been made in rooms where chalk dust moved in sunbeams and where men and women soldered and measured and then broke things and then made them strong again. It had been changed in a way that allowed it to survive the outrage of a gun. It had been combined with a mount and a director and a radar, and with training that taught a man with a wheel to believe what a needle told him instead of what his heart told him. It had been carried across the world in crates and in mines and in muscles, and when it finally met the place where it would matter, it expanded air into a shape that sent death out in a new way. The enemy called this choice unfair in quiet moments and then accepted it in louder ones, and the men who used it refused to think of it as anything other than another piece of gear that needed to be cleaned and checked and loaded and aimed and fired at the right time for the right reason. The 10th Army watched the ground change color as reins shifted and clay turned to grip that failed boots and wheels. The 5th Fleet watched the sky change tone and saw the arithmetic of spring and summer reshape the clouds. The radar pickets add and subtract and multiply in minutes, turning the world into numbers and then into plots and then into orders. The pilot looking down on the picket does not care for numbers. He cares for the thin board in his hand that shows the route and the simple belief that if he knocks over the small thing he will break the large thing. The destroyer feels the same about him. The proximity fuse does not feel at all. It simply performs. Another day, another wave, a picket further north, a station number that men who were on it will never forget and men who were not on it will never remember with any precision. A destroyer escort finds herself the only thing between two tracks that had been thought to be one. A light cruiser opens with secondary batteries that add a lower drumbeat to the sentence the 5-inch guns are saying. A destroyer with a familiar name takes two and refuses the third, and men who hear about it write the name on a bulkhead with a chalk stub, as if names do anything other than make language heavy. A carrier group to the south takes a hit that sends a column up that can be seen by men on the beach, and those men do the small nervous laugh you find when someone past one wall dies loudly and you are still alive here and you feel shame but you are also relieved, and relief is sometimes cruel in its taste. In a wardroom on a cruiser, a man has written 2 words on a corner of a map. Ruhr pocket. He has done this because he overheard a conversation about how the war in Europe will end, about how divisions will be pocketed and told to stop being divisions, and how the men who can read that story now from the sea are the kind who like to know the whole of a thing even when they only own one part of it. He turns to the man next to him and mentions 9th Panzer Division with a tone that suggests he respects anyone who has to hold steel together while breaking, and the other man nods and says that good units die the same way here and there, with a straight back and with the enemy building a pocket around them, and that even this can be understood by reading a short page on Wikipedia.org that says what happens when momentum is spent. They both leave the room to watch the sea in the same instant because the sound from topside will not let them stay. The pilot from Kyushu, who still breathed after 3 rings of air, had closed around him, saw a destroyer turn under him, and he lifted and tried to roll and felt a piece touch his shoulder that was hot and foreign. He pushed his hand forward and the nose lowered too little, and he understood that he had entered the narrowest part of the sky, where air existed only as a negotiation. He had time to see the bow wave of the destroyer combed by its own guns and time to notice that the ship leaned as any living thing leans into effort. He thought he was not alone in this, that enemies in war are never alone, that the same air holds both breaths. He went into that air and the ship moved out from under him without moving, because the gun crews and the fuse and the director and the men in CIC had seen the world a second faster than he did, and that is the kind of second that ends a story. The destroyer did not pause. The captain did not allow the sense of arrangement that comes when a storm passes to teach them false lessons. The gunnery officer looked at the crates of VT fuses stacked in the handling room and felt the old superstition rise that says that tools are spirits that must be fed, and he told himself it was nonsense and he believed only half of himself. The men on the mounts smelled their shirts and noticed they had become old men for a moment, and then they were young again because the guns let them, and then the sky finished its sentence and allowed quiet for long enough to let ears decide what wind sounds like. In the Okinawa hills, a forward command post sent coordinates for a ridge that had turned itself into a knife between two regiments, and the artillery observation point on a coral knob translated those numbers into degrees that made sense. A Marine on a dump detail ran a hand through damp hair and thought of Henderson Field far away and of how this island has its own Henderson in a different language, an airfield that belongs to the enemy and yet has the same smell of oil and red dirt under an endless sun. He did not know that the word proximity had saved him twice before noon. He only knew that he had a bruise on his shoulder from a crate that had shifted and that the man next to him breathed like a bellows that has a hole. The radar picket ring changed as the Fifth Fleet turned points of the compass into a defense that flexed and rested and flexed again. Some destroyers left and others arrived. Supplies rolled out and ammunition sailed in. The VT fuse supply did not run dry because the men on larger ships moved them in neat stacks and because the sea allowed the stacks to arrive through nights when nothing should have. The Japanese pilots came on days when weather said no and on evenings when thin clouds said maybe and on mornings when the sea lay wide and white and made their shadows ripple. They came in groups at heights that defied reason. They came alone with faces that had no expression at all. They came and found a web. They did not find the old sky. Kikusui 10 would come. The 10th Army would move south and east and write the names of towns on signboards and then write them again because the letters did not look like letters when covered in dust. The 5th Fleet would continue to pick up men from water that did not care for men and to collect burned paint like a kind of skin disease. The proximity fuse would continue to decide and decide and decide until the day came when no more decisions were asked of it. The pilots in Kyushu would run out of aircraft and out of fuel and out of men, but not out of courage, because courage is a fountain that does not require reason. On the last afternoon that mattered to the destroyer on Station 8, a cloud bank sat on the horizon like an audience. A flight of vowels came out of it and were converted into debris by a pattern of bursts that resolved into a curtain no bird would dare. A single zero came through and tried to slice the destroyer with a knife that had been sharpened across 1,000 miles of water and 900 days of war, and the destroyer avoided the knife by being the right shape at the right speed at the right second. The VT fuse still found space around the zero to argue with, and the argument ended with a splash. The ship finished the minute. Men breathed in and out. The day moved on toward a night where the sea would go dark and the wakes would glow green with the tiny living light that has no stake in war at all. The pilot who had fallen to proximity felt the last seconds compress into a feeling that he recognized from early school, when a teacher would interrupt him and ask him to recite and his mind would go blank, but his mouth would find words anyway, and sometimes they were good. He wanted to find the words that say what it means to aim a body in the direction of a thing you fear and love at the same time. He had no words left. The air took them as payment, and what he did instead was to keep his hands steady. He met the sea, and the sea kept his secret. The destroyer steamed another circle and another, a small coin spent over and over in a street where men lose larger coins and do not notice. The crew ate in shifts and tried to make jokes that were not about death because that kind of joke goes flat after a while and tastes wrong. The proximity fuses were moved under covers as if they were cold at night. The gunnery officer wrote a line on a pad and put the pad away in a place where, if the ship were opened like an oyster, a man would find it 30 years later and read the handwriting and understand. He wrote only 2 words. It works. The war in Europe folded itself and the men on the Pacific decks felt the far-off pressure change without knowing why. Someone mentioned that somewhere armies in the West pressed a pocket shut and the names of panzer divisions were recited in the mess of a cruiser, as if they were saints to be remembered or adversaries to be saluted. Names that sound like iron. The messmen did not care. The men on the guns did not care. The men flying from Kyushu did not care. The sea did not care. Okinawa cared, and it would care for months more, and then it would remember differently for generations after, keeping the salt in its caves and the names in its concrete. After the last Kikusui, the radar pickets steamed home with dents and holes and new paint, and with feelings they could not talk about well. The VT fuses were counted, and the counts were numbers that went up and down and then stopped when the bins were empty and the shells with other noses were all that remained. The destroyer found her anchorage, and the men washed the perimeters of their world and scraped salt from the edges and shook their heads at how it still clung. The captain wrote a page in a book and closed the book and put it in a drawer and wondered if he would ever want to open it again. The gunnery officer sat on a coil of line and put his hand against cold steel and let the cold run up his arm into his chest until some other temperature argued, and then he stood and went back to where tools needed him. The pilot's mother waited for a letter that would never come. A man in a small office wrote one line on a piece of paper that had boxes to be checked and returned to a file. A clerk stamped it and placed it in a stack. The stack weighed a certain number of pounds. Someone measured those pounds. Someone later counted them again and put them in a table in a book that would teach a boy in a classroom to say the word attrition without tasting it. The boy would leave the classroom and read about other parts of the war in Europe and learn names like 21st Panzer Division and 9th Panzer Division and remember them because numbers sit well in a young mind that likes order. And he would not think of a sky filled with rings of air that were detonations that did not need a hit to kill, and that is understandable because a mind can only hold so many kinds of pain at once. Okinawa would end the way that big battles end, with a breath that felt like an empty room, with men walking in files down roads that had not been roads before and on beaches that had become like cities, with ships turning their bows toward another horizon because orders do not allow anything else, with coastal guns rusting in place, with stories told quietly, then less quietly, then at tables where food is abundant and beer is cold and the night is something you can choose to walk into or not, with a radar picket destroyer tied up and rocking in a swell that has no opinion, with a long afternoon shadow across a mount that looks like a part of a machine and is, and once had been a part of a life. Years later, a man would stand on a museum deck and look at a shell with a cutaway that shows a small glass tube and a coil and a bit of solder and wonder how something so plain could change a map. He would listen to an older man describe the sound a 5-inch mount makes when it is at perfect balance and the way the voice on the phones changes pitch when the director locks on. He would walk away and put his hand on a metal rail and feel it cool and feel his palm leave a small warmth that evaporates. He would not say proximity fuse out loud and he would not need to. He would feel instead the way air can be instructed to betray a body. The thin knives on the horizon still go out to sea in peacetime and wartime. The sea still demands small circles to be held with invisible lines. The men still stand beside weapons whose minds are sealed. The sky still becomes a room where a man must decide whether to plot or to trust, and the best answer remains both. The names of the battles change. The tools change. The rules do not. Someone will someday fly low and think that wind and bravery are enough, and someone else will stand under a power plant that sounds like a giant cat and believe that mathematics and courage are sufficient, and between them a third thing will exist, something that is neither heroism nor gadget, but the commitment to make 1 second count more than another, and to keep making it count until the world changes. When historians write lists, the words will still be clean. Kikusui, radar picket, 5th Fleet, 10th Army,
5-38 caliber,
Mark 37 Director, SG Radar, VT Fuse, Okinawa. They will proceed to other lists with other shapes. 21st Panzer Division, 9th Panzer Division, Ruhr Pocket,
El Alamein.
They will link them with bright lines that look elegant in print and are a kind of mercy, because the lines are easier to see than the bursts that happen 6 meters from a wing. Readers will follow and nod. The sea will keep its own account, in rings of air that nobody saw and that everyone felt, in salt that never dries, in scuppers that taste like iron. The men who were there will sometimes wake with a ring in their ears that is not a shell burst and not a human voice but the memory of a decision made in the sky by a small brain inside a nose that knew time precisely and distance intimately and wrote 2 words across a corner of a world. Not close. Enough.